today we're going to be looking at is the art of war. Uh, this is the text that I have, right? The Art of War, translation, Sun Tzu. Cool. So we're going to be starting with chapter 4 since we did 1 through 3 last time. So the first one that was one of the major principles is that through not making mistakes or through our own wisdom, making wise choices, we become invincible, right? And so when we're looking for our edge to win and defeat the enemy, what we're actually looking is to strike the weaknesses and the foolishness of the opponent, right? We can't decide the weaknesses to strike. We can't create weaknesses, well, quote unquote weaknesses, but they're already there. Yeah, and our job is to just find and make distinctions between their strengths, the cities with walls, and areas where they're not defended, right? You know, so knowing where they're stronger, where they're weaker, and attacking them where they're weaker, attacking their mind where they're weaker, we can attack and win the battle, right? So that's the main principle. And so if we have a strong mind, we're wise, we make great decisions, our methodology is on point, we get everything organized in such a way where, basically, they can't defeat us, right? If we just negate their edge while preserving ours, right? So our edge comes from exploiting the foolishness of our opponent, right? That's where our edge comes from. And then our negating the opponent's edge, right, is fixing the leaks in our game, right? You could take this to any pretty much take this to any game, right, or any situation in life if we have an opponent or an adversarial relationship, right? So we can make ourselves invincible so that we can buy time, quote unquote, so that when they make a mistake, we're right on there and we're gonna get on their case, right? What's next? So the enemy can't hurt you. Yep. So basically, there's two parts to this. There's gaining knowledge and wisdom about yourself and your own tendencies, right? Possible leaks. Basically, having that self-reflective principle and constantly reviewing and making yourself, quote unquote, invulnerable by knowing more and being wiser about yourself, right? Then learning more and more wisdom and distinction between your enemy, right? So if you could draw some ideas of what your enemy likes to do, or some preferences, or what they tend to do, or behaviors, history, their relationships with the lords, their lay of the land, what terrain do they like, right? You can make all these distinctions, and then you can get a better sense of who you're dealing with, and therefore know where they're weaker, because if you know what their their preferences is, then you can maybe reverse engineer what they don't like. Or if you know what they don't like, then, you can strike that. Let's see. Victory comes in the edge, not the actual conflict. So basically, victory comes in wisdom, not the actual battle or conflict, right? Because wisdom is deciding which battle or conflict to get into, or whether or not to get into a battle or conflict, and then to be victorious, because all that matters is, especially in that, war, right? All that matters is winning, right? All that matters is winning. So sometimes conflict is not the best idea. Sometimes you're more advantaged using negotiation, or buying time, or speeding things up, or looking like you're over here and being a distraction while something else happens in the background, right? Or you're buying time for the other feudal lords to, do whatever, right? They actually talked about that, right? So it comes from your edge, your wisdom, right? Because if you're wise enough to know when to strike and when not to, and they don't, basically the entire field is under your control. You control the enemy, right? You give them the path of least resistance to their own defeat. That's what you do, and that's what Sun Tzu talks about. I'm just going to say Sun Tzu. You can correct me down below the correct pronunciation, but I'm just going to say Sun Tzu, or whatever. Let's see. Measure first, then cut, right? So become wise, and then strike, right? Don't strike first and then try to measure or become wise, right? Because you can't become wise in the moment, right? You can't reflect on yourself and your own personal preferences, weaknesses, taking everything into context, learning, knowledge. It's a lot of this stuff is about knowledge. So gaining the most knowledge and being able to cross contextualize everything that you know into making better decisions and coherency, right? Then you'll win before you even fight, because you're the superior general, because you're wise enough to know when to strike and when not to, right? And you know where to. It's all about distinction. It's all about distinction. It's the absolute to the event, right? So if you know absolute, like if you, right, so imagine you have, because this is kind of, this book, the majority of this book is metaphysics and putting metaphysics into war, right? It's actually not the art of war, it's the metaphysics of war, because wisdom is a quality. It isn't actually something that can be measured, right? Knowledge can be measured, and episteme knowledge can be measured, right? You can measure, do you know this? No. Do you know this? Are you wise? Ugh, well, right? It's not something, right? So when somebody says art, right, you're ascribing to a value, to a quality that isn't actually measurable, right? I could paint something and it wouldn't be worth crap, but, I could paint something, or I could spend years and years, getting the various pigments and drawing stuff and paint stuff, right? Years and years and years and years and years, right? And the colors are the same. The quality of how those colors intermingle and how they affect the person that would buy them is where the money is. And they get money, and then it gets more valuable over time, especially when the artist is dead, right? Because there's a scarcity, there's this quality, there's this extra thing that can't just be, if you just put something in a copier and it was the exact same picture, the qualitative difference is what makes the photocopied machine one that's might be perfect worth nothing compared to the actual painting. The Mona Lisa is worth a crap ton, while every copy is not, unless somebody was like, this is the Mona Lisa, and somebody was like a fool enough to buy it, right? Quote unquote Mona Lisa. It was the Mona Lisa, quote unquote. Yeah, so there's this qualitative distinction, and qualitative is the quality that we're going for is that we have all the possibilities, and all we're doing is that before the fact, we're drawing distinctions of what's the wisest course of action, right? And so then you have the ordinary and the extraordinary, the orthodox and the unorthodox, right? So you do the things that work, right? You do the things that work, and then you do the things that are unknown. Then you do the things that are coherent with the principle of wisdom, right? Coherent with quote-unquote nature, right? We could consider that nature, but haven't been done before. That would take them off mentally doing things, right? It's kind of difficult. Like, a lot of this is just like, trying to paint a picture of what the art is, right? So somebody could talk about the qualitative things of painting, but can't actually teach, but is not actually a book about teaching you how to paint. Well, there's some useful stuff about, back in the day, how they used to fight and what was wise and what was not, and things to stick to. Useful principles, like you don't attack people by crossing the river and attacking them on the other side. No. You don't attack uphill. That's also another one. Yeah. So what's next? Yeah, so that was basically chapter 4. And when you're wise, you can be able to explore possibilities and be creative and find patterns in the world and then execute them, right? Because they're coherent with what your purpose is, and they're actually pretty smart, wise, that kind of stuff. And then you use lateral thinking as the tool in which you find those possibilities, right? You use nonlinear thinking, and then you just simply, after you made tons and tons of ideas, then you scratch the ones, edit the ones out that aren't going to work, or you modify them, you change them, and then you execute the ones that are quote unquote unorthodox, but more than often, you'll probably get 1 in 100 that is actually pretty brilliant. And if you do that 1 per battle, 1 per fight or whatever, you'll win, because you'll have a new unorthodox thing that they're not expecting that's perfectly coherent that will defeat them. All right, now chapter 5. Yeah, so do what works to get, basically do what works, right? Fighting downhill works, okay? Then do the creative, and then the creative and the unorthodox is where you get your edge, and then you crush them, because then you're leading. You're making them reactionary to you, right? You then draw the path for the their thought process and water to flow to their defeat, right? So you're just manipulating and carving the mountain so that when they're in the heat of the battle, they're going down the path of least resistance, which you laid out beforehand, because you're not actually fighting, quote unquote, the army, right? You're fighting the mind of the enemy general, right? So if you make them reactionary and you put in, you're thinking 1 step ahead, quote unquote, like a chess master, right? The chess master isn't playing the pawn, isn't playing against the pawn or the knight or the king or the queen on the board. He's looking up and he's seeing the person who's actually in charge, which is the grandmaster on the other side, right? It's not the pawn that makes the decisions, it's the grandmaster. And if you can mess with the grandmaster, it doesn't matter what the pawn does, because you'll crush him, right? Yeah, and basically the extraordinary is just a distinction in nature, or what would it be? It would be a coherent principle that's perfectly reasonable and rational, wise, that hasn't been explored before, right? So somebody who's incredibly wise can make wiser decisions than everybody else, and that would be considered extraordinary tactics or plans or strategizing, right? There's nothing beyond the absolute, right? If you think of an absolute principle like knowledge, or the absolute of the universe, there's like, if the universe is something and nothing doesn't exist, then everything outside the universe, there is nothing outside of the universe. If we thought of an absolute principle, or the metaphysics of what he's talking about, the Tao, right? Everything, the absolute, then where the advantage is finding distinction within it, right? So as much as we know, we're just finding distinctions within nature to make our lives easier. Yep. He said, order comes from chaos. No, chaos comes from order, right? Because chaos is just order we don't understand, right? So when you're looking into a war zone where there's chaos and people are fighting back and forth, and it's like a free-for-all, and things are exploding, things are doing things, and we see all these reruns and movies where they just show a whole bunch of natural disasters and riots across the world. Well, the thing is if that, the thing is that there are different timbres of order, right? There are different timbres of order. What principle is guiding that destructive behavior? Well, you get to the principle of what's guiding that behavior or that event, and then you realize that it's all in concordance. Like, it's all from that to that, right? When we get into a war zone or whatever, and it's a free-for-all, violence is king, coercion is king. If you want to get what you want and not die, coercion is king. That's what... If you want something, coercion. Need to eat? Coercion. Need to defend your family? Guess what? Coercion. That's the principle. So when we see those things, and wherever they are, because they've happened since the beginning of history, human history, recorded history, you know what principle is guiding that behavior. That the best thing that they got right now is coercion in order to get what they want. Right? It's that simple. Cool. And then the last principle is a little bit longer, but basically when you synthesize all this together, chapter 5 and 4, organizing a path of the least resistance for your enemies and allies to follow, for the enemy to defeat themselves, right? So basically you're being proactive, you're setting all the traps, they're falling into every single one. Like if you watch Like, it's basically, you're thinking one step ahead of the opponent. You're putting one inciting incident for them to go and lead to the next logical thing, and the only reason why you know that they do that is because you know them so well. Right? Um, it's like, okay, so watch this. Let me tell a story. So there's an axe guy. There's an axe murderer. He's charging at you. You're like, oh crap. So you run into the next room, you close the door, and he's swinging his axe at the door and saying, here's Johnny. Okay? So then you're like, well, I know I have a bear trap because you have a bear trap because, let's just say we're in Montana or whatever. So we have a bear trap. You open it. You put it, you open it up. You put it down on the thing before he sees anything, and you cover it with the blanket, the rug, or whatever. Then what you do is that you go to the next door, you open it up, and then you slam it really hard, and then you run into the other room, like, quietly, and you leave the door open. Then you get your baseball bat, and then what he's going to do is that he's going to open the door, step on the bear trap, get really pissed off. He's going to see the closed door. What are you doing? What are you doing? What information did you give him? You're feeding him strategically information to make all the wrong moves. You're giving him the path of least resistance to his own defeat, because guess what he's going to do? He's going to start slamming on the thing, and guess what? That room that you slammed the door, that's not where you keep your guns. It's the other room that's open, and guess what you're doing? There you go, right? And then you also have this distance because he's slamming the door, getting his axe stuck in the door, because it's maple. And then you stand behind him, 10, 20 feet, or, well, 10 feet probably. And depending how feisty you are, he is now no longer the dude who is in power, right? He had an axe, he had an advantage, no longer has an advantage because he can't run as fast since the bear trap's on his leg, right? If he's Jason or whatever, Jason, and you have like a gun, like 10 feet away, so he has to hurt himself in order to get close enough. Not to mention that you're probably unloading the entire thing into his torso, which he probably doesn't have the necessary means to protect himself because he's an axe murderer. Because he doesn't play games where people fight back, right? Right. So who won? Who led the other to the path of least resistance to the enemy's defeat? You did. And then could you also do that behavior for your ally? Yeah, you can make the path of least resistance for them to be at a strategic advantage. You could do that. But what you do is then there's this next idea of she, or SHIH, right? Where basically what you do is that you put all these steps ahead, right? You're the one that's thinking steps ahead and making them make choices. If you're making the other person make choices about what they're going to do, the enemy, is losing. If their enemy is thinking, oh my god, what is he going to do? What is he going to do next? They lose, right? Because they can't set traps of their own when they're thinking about all the stuff that you're doing. And if you're flowing like this and they're trying to figure you out, man, they can't. They can't. Yeah. So basically, you path of least resistance to their own defeat, and then you're also taking the path of least resistance in order to take advantage of the weaknesses that you've basically been able to, quote unquote, manufacture because they've made all the decisions you want, right? So who's in control, them or you? You. You can decide who wins and loses. There's no fight, and that's what Sun Tzu's talking about. Sun Tzu, I don't care. Yeah. Right. Orthodox and unorthodox, right? The unorthodoxies of years past, right? It was unorthodox to have a flintlock, thing manufactured but it could defeat armor, so everybody went to guns. That's a very shorthand and very hack and slash, thing of history. But the things that are unorthodox, that are coherent with nature, that win, those get adopted, and the orthodoxies of what worked in the past no longer don't, or they fall out of fashion. Right? So that was chapter 4 and chapter 5 of The Art of War. So the next one, we're going to be looking into the next few chapters. Here we go. Love to hear your comments below. Bye-bye.